Hi, and welcome back to Consordini.com. I'm Justin Leopard here today with another cello lesson for you, and today we're going to delve a little bit deeper into how to cross strings. Crossing strings is the term for when you're on one string, then you cross over to another string and play that string instead. So even if you've started on some of the most basic cello repertoire, you've probably already been asked to do this. Twinkle Twinkle Little Star crosses over to the A string from the D string. So sometimes it can be hard to do this. Sometimes you get a squeak. Sometimes you don't get the string to sound out right. So I just want to go over some of the things that go into that, demystify it, so that you're able to problem solve it and practice the right way. So a few of the things to keep in mind about string crossings are that every string is a different thickness, so it requires a different amount of weight, grip, and feel in the fingers to play with a similar tone to the other strings. The other thing is that because the bridge is curved, all of the strings are at a different angle. So this would be in contrast to a guitar where all of the strings are totally parallel to each other. In this case, we have to change the angle of the bow, though in every case, physics will tell us that there's a certain best angle for drawing a good sound from the string. So these are kind of the two parameters we have to keep in mind, that it's a different gauge string and it's a different angle. So as far as the gauge of the string goes, this is actually something that really is super important to practice actively. We talked about this in another video about the bow hold, but just making sure to practice all of the open strings so that you know what a good tone even sounds and feels like on each of those strings. And one of the ways that we can do this is by maximizing the angle that we have against the string. So for example, you can think about this as though your arm is a machine. If you're playing the A string and you want your bow to be, pretty much perpendicular to the string, and you're drawing in a particular direction. Now, if I want to keep it perpendicular to the string, it causes my wrist to go outward, right? So this is why a bow hold is always going to have to be a flexible thing we talked about. But in this case also, what I'm trying to say is that in terms of your hand being able to be the most relaxed in order to get that angle, you have to have a certain angle also of your wrist. So it's worth messing around with what's the actual most relaxed way that you can get a good tone on the string. Versus so generally, when I'm playing on a higher string, I can play a little bit closer to the bridge, perhaps, compared to playing close to the fingerboard. I can also use a little bit more bow, faster bow that is to say, compared to lower strings. And this makes sense. Violinists actually have slightly longer bows even because their strings are thinner still. And with thin strings, you want to move a little bit more. With low strings, you're not going to move as much. So a comparable used that much of the bow for that sort of sound. Used that much of the bow. So pretty significant difference between the strings in terms of how fast you're moving. And also in terms of, I didn't know, so let's note the difference in contact point. So that was about there, so we would expect it to be here, but let's see what I gravitate to. Pretty close, but maybe a shade closer to the fingerboard. So at this point, I feel like in order to talk more deeply about the tone of the strings, it's useful to jump over to the other issue, which is the actual crossing of strings, the actual motion between them. So the way that I was taught to conceive of this is to imagine that I'm rowing a boat, because it's not going to be as useful to think about your hand coming up. You can see if my hand just goes up and down, it's harder for me to stay actually at the right angle for the string. So instead, if I were to only go out with my hands, I can actually cross all the strings too. And some blend between going up and out. But thinking about how it goes out is going to help you be able to make that transition over the curvature of the string. So let's do something together. If you have your cello out, we're just going to work on crossing between the D and the A, down bow to up bow. Very, very basic. So a few of the pitfalls that you might run into if you do this are strings choking up, or in some other way not quite getting a clear articulation on your notes. And one thing that I want us to do together is really try to find a resonant way of playing each of the notes. And all that means is basically I'm not trying to force anything out. I'm actually just trying to find the relaxed position that my hand can take to easily play a note that rings out. When I find that on both strings, I sort of have my frame of reference for what two sounds I'm trying to go between. So now our only job is to connect those two sounds. So I feel this impulse into the string and it lifts out and goes to the side. So I'm going to have to prepare my elbow so that it's ready to bring the arm forward so that the wrist can lead the up bow of the A string. Hopefully that makes sense to you. In really slow motion, it would be... And that's not a bad way to do it either, where it doesn't quite matter if there's a pause between the notes, just focusing on the slow motion physicality. And it's very useful in this instance too to just think about keeping a really consistent contact point. It's really easy to end up doing stuff like that, and then you're like, well, why doesn't this sound right? So being really consistent is the key. The mystery of cello is taken away a little bit once you realize that it is you. In terms of if something different happens, it was something somewhere different that was happening physically with the instrument that caused it to happen. So the more we can find all these different ways of being consistent, the better of a time we're going to be having. So going back to tone and string crossings, we just sort of started touching upon it with the resonant note playing in order to string cross and with this road approach to bowing. But I think this is a great opportunity too to talk about impulse with the bow. And the sort of subtler motions that your fingers are going to be doing as you play. As my hand's moving, my fingers have different tendencies. My ring finger, for example, which is very long, has a tendency to not be engaged much. I don't lose that much stability from losing the ring finger. By contrast, much harder to play without the index finger. Or without the pinky, because these two are really balancing the bow. And so when we're thinking about string crossings and we're thinking about having these clear notes, it's important to think about where that impulse is coming from. So I think a good way of thinking about it is that from your shoulder to your elbow, you want to have a good structure so that there can be an angle with your forearm. That's not a very... so that there can be an angle with your forearm, and then a relaxed hand, and then active fingers, right? So I think it's worth kind of going through that process mentally. You can just think about that and try to have a moment of awareness for each of these things as you're practicing. Because ultimately, when you're crossing strings and you're not thinking about your shoulder, just watch my shoulder for a second doing this example. I mean, it's moving in every note, so obviously it plays a factor and it's important to keep aware of it. So when we're doing some other types of string crossings, what if we were to slur this, for example? It's the same sort of concept where you have to find, so in there I was trying to think, okay, so I'm still pulling as I switch my strings. So what that means is that I have to time exactly right when my bow's actually going to cross over so that I know when to do the little sweep motion with the arm that is the actual crossed of the string. See, so right there I got the squeak because I was still holding the D string at the same level, right? So what you want to be able to do instead is actually go from playing the resonant D to playing a little bit further up on the bow, the resonant A. And that sounds nicer because now I've paid attention to that. I hope that you were able to hear the difference, because when I first was playing that, it was having a little more issues. And then when I was able to break down and address where the two spots on the bow of resonance were, I was able to have a much better sound with it. So one thing that's really helpful in practice is just to sit down and be like, I'm just going to practice a few different bowings of string crossings and work out how to play them. So finding first and foremost the good resonance of each individual note, and then sort of trying to work out how can I connect them. It's in both the notes and the connections between the notes that music happens, in my opinion. And the notes on the page are one of them, and then the mastery is in often how you're able to connect the notes in between. Let's talk about just a couple of other examples of string crossings that are likely to come up, just so that I've given you my approach for them specifically, and then we'll wrap up. So another one you might find often is the opposite of the first one we did, where instead of going down up, we'll go up down. And in this one, you could actually probably move your wrist first, where if you let your fingers come up and then let your elbow come up. And what I like about that is that it creates a whole motion with the arm. There's just something very natural feeling about doing it that way, almost like I'm just making a big circle. Pretty fun. Okay, and then the final one that we'll talk about is a rolled chord, because those are fun and glorious. And it's like at the start, if you are trying to do the Bach cello suite, there's kind of a rolled chord. There's the and if you've been trying to play that movement and you've been struggling, which I also have a lot, it's because of all these string crossings. So this is where this stuff really comes in useful, really working out, okay, this is almost just a chord, these first three notes. So, okay, so there's my resonance there, a little bit further up on the string on the D. There's my resonance there, and a little bit further up on the A. I'm relaxed with my hand, and I just reach into the string, relax everything, and I let go, and it's the resonant, right? So how do I connect these? Well, if you kind of imagine the super awesome camera angle close to the bow, whasha, right? A very natural movement of the bow, whasha. Then I can imagine pulling the bow almost more than anything else. And then conversely, kind of pushing the bow on the upstrip bows. Now, maybe that's not the right interpretation of that piece, but just good practice for trying to get really open and resonant string crossings. So I hope that this method of trying to break down the resonance, the angles, relaxed with your hands, and the connections between the notes, even though these are all a bit abstract concepts, all of it is really the core of how we get to these answers with playing cello. So I really hope that they're useful, and I'm happy to help demystify further. Let me know in the comments if you need to know anything else, or if these things have been useful for you. As always, we've really enjoyed having you watch us. Once again, I'm Justin Leopard with Consordini.com. We'll see you next time.